In the spring of 1989, the night sky over Puerto Rico was calm and clear. At the Arecibo Observatory, the world's largest radio telescope stood silently in the hills, its giant dish pointed upward toward the endless stars. For most people, it was an ordinary evening, but for the small group of scientists on duty, it would become a night they would never forget. The observatory often picked up signals from deep space, natural radio waves from stars, galaxies, and pulsars. Usually these signals were faint and scattered, nothing unusual, just the normal background noise of the universe. But that evening, as the machines continued their routine scans, something strange appeared on the monitors. At first it was just a flicker, a tiny spike in the data. The technicians thought it might be interference, maybe from a passing satellite or even a glitch in the equipment. They had seen that kind of thing before. One of the younger scientists leaned closer to the screen and frowned. The signal didn't look random. It had a rhythm, a pulse, almost like it was repeating on purpose. The room grew quiet. One after another, the scientists gathered around the monitor. The signal was faint, barely above the noise, but it was definitely there. And more importantly, it was repeating. Every few seconds, the same pattern came through again and again, like a heartbeat echoing across the stars. Someone whispered, "This isn't natural." The team quickly ruled out local interference. They checked the machines, recalibrated the telescope, even cross-checked with smaller instruments. But the signal didn't disappear. It kept coming, steady and deliberate. Soon they realized it wasn't just any signal. It was structured. It carried the rhythm of distress. In Morse code, it would have been the universal cry for help. SOS. The realization sent a chill through the room. For a moment, nobody spoke. They were trained scientists, rational and disciplined, but what they were hearing didn't belong to nature. It sounded like a message, a call for help. One of the senior astronomers, a man who had spent his whole life searching the skies, finally broke the silence. His voice was calm but heavy with disbelief. "If this is real, then someone out there is asking us to help them." The gravity of his words sank into everyone's mind. For decades, humans had looked into the sky and wondered if they were alone. There had been theories, debates, even false alarms, but never something this clear, this deliberate. If the signal truly was an SOS, then humanity had just received its first undeniable proof. We were not alone in the universe. News of the signal spread quickly through scientific channels. By the next morning, experts around the world were aware of what had been detected. Some dismissed it immediately, claiming it had to be a mistake. Others demanded to see the raw data. But as more observatories turned their instruments toward the coordinates, the same signal appeared again. Weak, distant, but consistent, the world began to stir. Governments were alerted. Military officials demanded to know if the signal was a threat. Was it a trap? Was it some foreign technology disguised as something extraterrestrial? Intelligence agencies launched investigations, while politicians argued over how much the public should be told. Meanwhile, ordinary people caught whispers of the discovery through rumors and leaks. Journalists began to dig. Stories appeared in newspapers, first as speculation, then as cautious reporting. Within weeks, the world was buzzing with the news. A mysterious SOS had been heard from space. The reactions were mixed. Some people were terrified. If another civilization was advanced enough to send signals across the stars, what else could they do? Were they hostile? Was Earth in danger? Others, however, felt awe and excitement. For them, this was the moment humanity had dreamed of, proof that intelligent life existed beyond Earth. The thought that someone out there needed help made people feel both fearful and deeply connected. At the Arecibo Observatory, the scientists kept working tirelessly. They stayed up long nights analyzing the signal, trying to decode it further. The pattern was simple, almost primitive, just like an emergency beacon. No complex language, no hidden meaning, just SOS again and again. Whoever had sent it wasn't trying to confuse or impress. They were desperate. The simplicity of the message made it even more haunting. These weren't conquerors or explorers showing off their power. These were living beings, stranded or endangered, calling into the void with the most basic plea any intelligent creature could make. Help us. In university classrooms, professors debated the ethics of responding. Should humanity send a reply? If so, what should we say? Could we risk revealing our location to a civilization we knew nothing about? Others argued that we had no choice. If someone was crying for help, ignoring them would be inhumane. The discovery began to ripple through society in unexpected ways. Artists painted visions of distant civilizations sending their cries through the cosmos. Musicians wrote songs inspired by the lonely signal. Philosophers revisited age-old questions about humanity's place in the universe. Religious leaders gave sermons interpreting the SOS as a sign, some calling it a warning, others a divine reminder of compassion. In homes across the world, families gathered around television screens as news anchors discussed the implications. Children asked their parents if aliens were real, and for once the parents didn't have an easy answer. For the scientists at Arecibo, the emotional weight was immense. They weren't just studying numbers on a graph anymore. They were the first humans to hear the voice of another world. Some of them admitted in private that the signal kept them awake at night. They would close their eyes and imagine who or what was out there, waiting, hoping that their message had reached someone. The longer the signal was monitored, the more urgent it seemed. Its strength faded in and out, as if whatever transmitter was sending it was failing. This added a terrible urgency to the mystery. If they didn't act quickly, the chance to help, or even to learn the sender's identity, might be lost forever. Governments began to feel the pressure. The United States, the Soviet Union, China, and several European nations all held secret meetings. Military leaders wanted to control the situation, fearing the unknown. Scientists urged transparency, reminding the world that this was not just a matter of security but of history, of humanity's future. For once, even rival nations realized that the signal belonged to everyone. It wasn't American, Soviet, or Chinese, it was universal. As the weeks passed, the weight of the message only grew heavier. It was no longer just about science. It was about humanity's conscience. Somewhere out there, far beyond the reach of any telescope, someone was calling for help. On that quiet night in 1989, when the signal first appeared on the monitor, the world had still felt ordinary. But with the discovery of that faint repeating SOS, everything changed. The stars above no longer seemed like cold, distant lights. They seemed alive, filled with voices we had only just begun to hear. The people who first detected it knew they had witnessed the beginning of a new chapter in human history. The distress call had shaken not just a handful of scientists in Puerto Rico, but the entire planet. Humanity for the first time felt the truth in its bones. We were not alone. And somewhere out there, someone needed us. When the strange SOS from deep space was confirmed by observatories around the world, the first shock slowly gave way to something more complicated: fear, doubt, and fierce debate. Scientists were certain it was no natural signal, and they kept insisting that it was a distress call. But politicians, generals, and world leaders saw the situation in a very different light. Inside closed rooms, the most powerful people on Earth argued. Some said this could be the single greatest moment in human history, the chance to prove that life existed beyond our planet. Others said it could be a trick, a trap laid by an unknown enemy. They asked hard questions. If someone had the technology to send signals across light years, what else could they do? Could they be stronger, smarter, and far more advanced than humanity? And if that were true, was answering them an invitation to danger? These doubts spread quickly. In Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and dozens of capitals, the mood was tense. Military advisors whispered of possible threats. Some imagined an alien fleet hiding in the shadows of space, waiting for humanity to reveal its position. Others feared the signal might not be alien at all. Maybe it was an advanced weapon test from another nation, disguised as something extraterrestrial. In the middle of the Cold War, suspicion was already a normal part of politics. The signal only made it worse. But there were voices on the other side too. Many scientists, philosophers, and humanitarians stood up and argued that ignoring the SOS would be a betrayal of what it meant to be human. They said it didn't matter if the sender was alien, human, or something in between. A cry for help was a cry for help. One well-known astronomer declared on live television, "When a ship is sinking, you do not ask who is on board. You throw a rope." His words were replayed again and again, stirring people around the globe. Soon the arguments escaped the walls of government buildings and reached the streets. Citizens demanded answers. Protests broke out in major cities. In New York, thousands carried signs that read, "Answer the call and we must help." In Paris, People marched through the streets chanting, "SOS means save our souls." But in other places there were rallies of fear, with banners saying "Don't trust them" and "Earth first." People shouted that Earth had enough problems of its own, from poverty to war, without inviting dangers from the stars. For the first time, humanity was not only divided by nations but also by philosophy, between those who wanted to respond with compassion and those who wanted to remain hidden. Meanwhile, secret meetings were taking place behind closed doors. Leaders from countries that had been enemies for decades suddenly found themselves sitting at the same table. In one historic gathering, American officials, Soviet generals, and European ministers all looked at the same charts and listened to the same recordings of the signal. For a long time, nobody spoke. The weight of history pressed down on them. They all knew that whatever decision was made would not belong to one country alone. It would belong to the entire world. These secret negotiations were filled with suspicion. Some leaders accused others of trying to use the signal for power. Some demanded that only their scientists should be trusted to handle the situation. But slowly, through long nights of debate, a fragile understanding began to form. Everyone realized that the SOS was too big for one nation to handle. No single country had the resources, technology, or knowledge to act alone. If they tried, they would fail, and perhaps doom not only themselves but also the entire planet. This realization led to something that had seemed impossible only months earlier. A coalition began to take shape. Nations that had been enemies in war, rivals in politics, and competitors in technology agreed to share information, resources, and even trust. At first it was reluctant and filled with hesitation, but as the days turned into weeks, the coalition grew stronger. Ordinary people around the world watched this development with a mix of hope and disbelief. News anchors described it as a miracle of necessity. Old enemies were shaking hands, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. One commentator said, "The SOS has done what centuries of diplomacy could not. It has forced us to think as one people, not many nations." Still, fear never fully disappeared. Inside military bunkers, generals drew up plans just in case the signal turned out to be hostile. Satellites were repositioned, early warning systems were checked, and spy agencies doubled their efforts to watch each other. Even in the face of unity, suspicion lingered like a shadow. But outside those guarded rooms, something new was happening among the public. For the first time in history, humanity was discussing itself not in terms of countries but as a species. People spoke of us and them, not America versus Russia or East versus West, but Earth versus the unknown. It was a subtle shift but a powerful one. Suddenly, all of humanity was on the same side of the table. In classrooms, teachers explained to children that they might live in a world where Earth was no longer alone. In churches, mosques, and temples, leaders spoke about the moral duty to care for neighbors, even neighbors among the stars. In universities, young students wrote essays about unity, about borders no longer mattering when faced with the vastness of space. Even so, the choice remained uncertain. Would humanity rise together or fall apart in mistrust? The coalition was fragile, built on fear as much as hope. Many believed it could collapse at any moment, torn apart by suspicion or greed. But others saw in it a spark of something greater, something humanity had always needed but never truly achieved: true global cooperation. The night the coalition was officially announced, the world seemed to pause. On television screens across continents, leaders from rival nations stood side by side. They didn't smile, they didn't celebrate. Their faces were grim, heavy with the burden of the unknown. But their words carried a quiet strength. They told the world that for the first time in history, nations were putting aside their differences to investigate a mystery that belonged to all humankind. For the billions watching, the message was clear. Humanity had reached a crossroads. The SOS from the stars was not just a call for help from another world. It was a test of Earth itself. Would people remain divided by flags and borders? Or would they rise as one species, united by the call of the universe? That choice hung heavy in every heart. For some, it was terrifying. For others, it was beautiful. But for everyone, it was undeniable. The signal had changed the world forever. When the decision was finally made to act, it was done in silence, away from the eyes of the world. Newspapers carried rumors, and people guessed at what their governments were planning. But the truth was far bigger than anything imagined. Behind closed doors, in secret laboratories and hidden facilities, the greatest engineering project in human history had begun. The signal from deep space was still pulsing faintly, a reminder that time was running out. No one knew how long the unknown senders would be able to hold on, or even if they were still alive. Some argued it was already too late. Others believed that as long as the signal continued, there was still hope. And so, under immense secrecy, humanity began to build something it had never dared to attempt before, a fleet capable of traveling beyond the stars. The challenge was enormous. Space travel had always been slow, expensive, and dangerous. Human beings had only reached the moon and sent robotic probes across the solar system. Interstellar travel, the journey between stars, was something that had lived only in dreams and science fiction. But the urgency of the SOS forced humanity to try the impossible. The brightest minds from every corner of the Earth were gathered. Scientists who had once competed bitterly for funding now found themselves sitting side by side. Engineers who once wore the badges of rival nations now wore only one, the badge of humanity. For the first time, knowledge flowed freely across borders. Secrets that had been locked away in military vaults for decades were suddenly shared. Because this was no longer a race between nations. It was a race against time. Russian rocket engineers, with their long history of building powerful launch systems, worked alongside American physicists, who brought advances in nuclear energy and deep space navigation. Chinese metallurgists contributed new alloys, metals strong enough to endure the stresses of interstellar travel. European shipwrights, experts in design and precision, shaped the very frames of the vessels. From Africa came breakthroughs in energy storage and sustainable power, ideas born from necessity that suddenly became the foundation for the fleet's engines. At first, the collaboration was uneasy. Old rivalries and grudges lingered. Generals distrusted one another. Politicians still feared betrayal. But slowly, something extraordinary happened. The work itself began to erase the divides. Engineers shared tools and ideas as if they had always been teammates. Scientists spent long nights together in labs, scribbling equations on boards, their excitement outweighing their accents or passports. Little by little, the walls of mistrust crumbled. The project grew larger every month. Entire factories were repurposed. New research centers were built in remote deserts and frozen tundras far from the public eye. Ships began to take shape in hidden hangars, their skeletons rising like monuments to a new era. Every piece of metal, every circuit, every bolt carried with it the weight of not just one nation, but of humanity itself. Ordinary workers, sworn to secrecy, knew they were part of something world-changing. Mechanics, welders, technicians, they all poured their skill and sweat into the project. Some went home at night unable to speak of what they had done, even to their families, but their pride shone in their eyes. They knew they were building not just machines, but hope itself. The scale of the project was staggering. Dozens of ships were planned, each larger than anything humanity had ever launched into space. They had to be fast, strong, and self-sustaining, able to travel for years or even decades. Entire teams worked on life support systems, figuring out how to recycle air, water, and food for the long journey. Others designed new engines, experimenting with nuclear fusion, antimatter concepts, and technologies that had only existed on paper. Of course, there were failures. Some prototypes exploded on test stands, engines overheated and melted. Designs collapsed under stress simulations. Every failure cost time, resources, and sometimes lives. But instead of tearing the coalition apart, the setbacks seemed to make the determination stronger. Each mistake was studied, corrected, and turned into progress. Humanity was learning together as one. Outside the hidden facilities, the world still did not know the full truth. People speculated, whispered, and wondered why their governments were spending billions in secret. Rumors of strange new rockets and vast construction projects leaked into newspapers, fueling wild theories. Some guessed the truth. Most did not. But inside the coalition, the work never stopped. As the years passed, what had started as a rescue mission slowly became something more. The ships were no longer just tools to answer the SOS. They became symbols. Symbols of what humanity could achieve when it rose above division. Men and women who had once called each other enemies now laughed together in workshops, their hands stained with the same grease, their eyes lit with the same dream. In the mess halls of hidden bases, workers from a dozen countries shared meals, trading stories in broken languages, teaching each other words and songs. They celebrated small victories together. A new alloy that didn't crack under pressure, an engine test that burned clean and steady, a life support module that worked flawlessly. Every success felt like a triumph for the entire planet. Children of the workers began to grow up with a different view of the world. To them, it wasn't strange to see a Russian scientist mentoring an American student, or a Chinese engineer teaching a Nigerian apprentice. To them, unity wasn't a dream, it was normal. Still, the pressure was enormous. Everyone knew the signal was weakening. There were nights when scientists stayed awake, staring at the faint SOS on their screens, wondering if they were already too late. Some cried quietly, knowing that the beings who had sent the call might already be gone. But even then, they kept building. Because even if the senders had perished, the effort itself had become something larger. It was no longer only about saving strangers across the stars. It was about saving humanity from itself. The project became the mirror in which humanity saw its better face. For centuries, wars had been fought over borders, resources, and power. Now those same nations were sharing everything they had, working side by side to build something impossible. The SOS had begun as a desperate cry from far away, but on Earth, it became the spark that ignited the greatest act of unity in history. By the time the first ships neared completion, the project was no longer hidden. The truth had spread, and the world knew what was being built. But the secrecy had served its purpose. It had allowed the coalition to lay the foundations without the weight of politics tearing it apart too soon. And when the people of Earth finally saw the shining hulls of the fleet, they saw not just metal and machines, they saw the proof that unity was possible. What began as a rescue mission had transformed into something far more powerful. The fleet was not only a response to an alien SOS, it was the embodiment of human potential, the living proof that when united, humanity could reach for the stars. And in that moment, the ships became more than vessels. They became a promise that Earth was no longer a planet divided but a people ready to rise together. By the mid-1990s, the world had been reshaped by the Great Project. Years of sacrifice, endless trials, and terrible tragedies had left their mark on every continent. But at last, after all the pain and struggle, the fleet was ready. For more than half a decade, people had lived with the project as a silent shadow in their lives. Families were separated as workers, engineers, and scientists disappeared into secret facilities for months or even years at a time. Letters went unanswered. Birthdays passed without mothers or fathers present, and children grew up not fully understanding why their parents were gone. But in their hearts, many of those families carried the same thought. The sacrifices were not in vain because something greater was being built. Economies had shifted dramatically. Vast resources had been poured into the construction of the fleet. Industries once focused on consumer goods were redirected toward advanced materials and aerospace technology. Whole cities were transformed into supply hubs, their factories working day and night. People learned to live with shortages, with rationing, and with slower comforts of daily life. Yet despite the hardships, there was pride in the air. People spoke of the project with hushed reverence, calling it the mission or simply the work. It became not just the job of scientists or governments, but the purpose of humanity. The cost had been high. Thousands gave their lives to the cause. Some perished in tragic accidents, rocket tests gone wrong, prototype ships that collapsed during assembly, experimental engines that exploded under stress. Each loss was a wound that spread grief across borders. But instead of breaking the effort apart, these tragedies only made the coalition stronger. Fallen workers were honored not as citizens of one nation, but as citizens of Earth. Their names were carved onto walls in secret halls, their stories told as part of the shared sacrifice for a future greater than themselves. At last, the day of the launch arrived. It was a day the world would never forget. For weeks leading up to it, the anticipation had been building. Whispers had become headlines, and soon, every television, every radio, every newspaper carried the same story. Humanity was about to launch the first united fleet into the stars. Billions of people prepared to witness history. The morning of the launch was unlike any other. In cities, villages, and remote corners of the world, people gathered around screens, radios, and even loudspeakers set up in public squares. Some stayed awake all night, too excited to sleep. while others prayed quietly for the safety of the mission. Schools closed for the day and workers were given time off. It wasn't just an event for scientists or politicians. It was an event for everyone. At the launch sites, the air was thick with tension. Massive ships stood ready, their silver hulls gleaming in the morning light. They were colossal, unlike anything humanity had ever built before, each one a city unto itself, designed to carry people and hope into the unknown. Engineers rushed through final checks. Pilots, clad in new suits designed for interstellar travel, sat in their stations silent and focused. Generals, scientists, and leaders stood together, their differences set aside as they waited for the moment that would mark the beginning of a new era. When the countdown began, the world seemed to hold its breath. 10, 9, 8. The numbers echoed not only from speakers at the launch sites but also across televisions, radios, and broadcasts worldwide. Children counted along in living rooms. Soldiers whispered the numbers in their barracks, and entire stadiums filled with people repeated the countdown together, their voices rising like one. 3, 2, 1, and then the earth shook. The engines roared to life with a force that could be felt miles away. Flames and smoke poured beneath the massive vessels as they slowly began to rise. At first it seemed impossible that something so huge could even lift from the ground. But then with a deep, thunderous power they climbed higher and higher into the sky. Billions watched as the fleet rose in coordinated formation, the ships ascending like a constellation being born before their eyes. For the first time in history, Earth was not watching rockets from one nation or another. Not a space race meant to prove superiority. This was different. These ships did not carry the flag of America, Russia, China, or any other single nation. They carried only one flag, the flag of humanity. Tears streamed down faces across the world. In living rooms, families hugged. In public squares, strangers held hands. In villages without electricity, people listened to radios powered by car batteries or hand-cranked generators, their eyes shining as they imagined the ships breaking free of Earth. For once, every person, no matter where they were born or what language they spoke, was united by the same sight, the same dream. It was not only a launch. It was a declaration. The SOS from deep space had not been ignored. Humanity had not cowered in fear. Instead, it had risen above its divisions, above its doubts, and had chosen to act. For many who watched, the ships seemed almost alive, as though they carried not just metal and technology, but the very spirit of Earth itself. They carried the sacrifices of workers who had died, the tears of families who had waited, the strength of scientists who had labored endlessly, and the hopes of billions who believed in something greater than themselves. The roar of the engines faded as the fleet disappeared into the sky, leaving trails of fire and smoke behind. Silence fell across the world. People stared at the heavens, knowing they had just witnessed the greatest moment in human history. Children who had counted down would tell the story to their grandchildren. Workers who had bent steel for the ships would point to the stars and say, "I was part of that." And deep inside, in the hearts of billions, something had changed. Humanity had been afraid for so long, afraid of the unknown, afraid of each other, afraid of the future. But that day, as the ships left Earth, fear was replaced with something far greater. It was not arrogance, not blind hope, but a will, an unstoppable will to act, to step beyond fear, to reach for the stars. The SOS had not only been heard, it had awakened something within humanity that had been buried for centuries, the courage to rise together. And as the fleet carried that courage into the void, Earth itself felt reborn, united not by fear but by hope. Though the final fate of the fleet remains uncertain, its impact on Earth could never be denied. Long after the great ships had vanished into the darkness of space, humanity on Earth continued to live with the memory of their departure. The sight of those colossal vessels rising in unison into the sky was burned into history forever. Whether the fleet had succeeded or failed, whether it had reached the senders of the SOS or not, one truth remained. Earth itself had been transformed. For centuries, nations had looked at each other with suspicion, building walls, armies, and weapons to defend themselves from one another. But after the fleet's launch, that way of thinking began to fade. Borders still existed, languages and cultures still differed, but nations no longer saw themselves as isolated powers. They began to see themselves as parts of one greater whole, members of a shared destiny that stretched beyond the Earth itself. Schools began teaching history in a new way. Children no longer learned only of kings, presidents, and wars between countries. They also learned about the moment when Earth became united, about the project that had brought together scientists, workers, and leaders from every land. They learned that their parents and grandparents had lived through an era when humanity stopped thinking only about survival and started thinking about purpose. The distress call from the stars, which at first had seemed frightening and mysterious, became less about who had sent it and more about what it had made humanity become. People realized that it didn't matter whether the call had come from aliens, from another human colony, or even from something unknown and lost. What mattered was the response. It had called out the best in humanity. It had pulled people away from fear and division and given them a chance to see themselves in a new light. In villages and cities alike, people told stories of those days with pride. Grandparents told their grandchildren how the world once seemed broken, full of arguments and wars until the SOS changed everything. Musicians sang songs about the unity of Earth. Artists painted murals of ships soaring toward the stars, and writers filled libraries with tales of the great mission. The story was retold again and again, not because of what happened to the fleet, but because of what the fleet represented, proof that humanity could rise above its fears. There were still disagreements on Earth, of course. People still argued about politics, about religion, about resources, but these arguments no longer carried the same weight as before. Deep down, most people remembered that when it mattered most, humanity had chosen to come together. Even the fiercest disagreement seemed small compared to the memory of what had been achieved. The SOS became a symbol, a reminder written into every nation's history books. It was carved onto monuments, quoted in speeches, and remembered in ceremonies. It was no longer just 3 simple letters, but a spark that had awakened the greatest force on Earth: unity. Scientists who had once been ignored or doubted became heroes, celebrated for their part in the great project. Engineers and workers who had sacrificed years of their lives were honored as builders of hope. And the families who had endured separation and loss were seen not as victims, but as the silent backbone of the mission. Their sacrifices had made it possible for the fleet to exist at all. The ships themselves, even though they were gone, remained alive in the imagination of the people. Children drew pictures of them in school. Adults dreamed of their shining hulls cutting through the void. Nobody knew what had happened to them, whether they had reached their destination, whether they had answered the SOS, or whether they had vanished into the endless night. But perhaps the mystery was part of what gave the story its power. The unknown became a canvas for hope. In some places, the fleet was spoken of as if it were still out there, moving silently between the stars, carrying the hopes of Earth on its journey. In other places, it was spoken of as a legend, like the great voyages of ancient explorers who once crossed oceans with nothing but faith in the horizon. And in both ways, it inspired people to believe that even the impossible could be attempted. Generations later, people would still look up at the night sky and wonder where the fleet had gone. Children would ask their parents, "Do you think they found who was calling?" And parents, though they had no answer, would smile and say, "What matters is that we tried." The greatest gift of the SOS was not the fleet itself, nor the technology that had been created, but the change it left behind. It awakened something that had always been hidden inside humanity, a will to act beyond fear. For centuries, fear had divided people: fear of the unknown, fear of strangers, fear of failure. But the distress call showed that when fear was put aside, when people chose courage and compassion, there was no limit to what they could achieve. Even long after the fleet's engines had faded from sight, people on Earth carried that lesson in their hearts. It shaped how nations spoke to each other, how they solved problems, and how they dreamed of the future. The memory of the SOS was like a light that kept burning, a reminder that humanity's greatest power was not its weapons, not its technology, but its ability to unite. Some believed that one day the fleet would return. They imagined the ships descending back to Earth, scarred and weathered from their long journey, but victorious, carrying stories of distant stars and the beings who had sent the call. Others believed the fleet would never return, that it had gone on to live forever among the stars, a gift from Earth to the universe. But whichever story people chose to believe, they agreed on one thing: the fleet had changed humanity forever. It had been forged not just from steel and fire, but from sacrifice, courage, and shared hope. It had been unstoppable not because of its engines but because of the unity that had built it, and in the end, that unity was stronger than any alien threat could ever be. The SOS had awakened humanity's unstoppable fleet, but more importantly, it had awakened humanity itself.